There's a small apartment on Rue Beautreillis in Paris that looks, from the outside, like it belongs to nobody in particular. 4 floors up, a single window facing a narrow courtyard. The kind of place that holds its silence differently from other places, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has been deliberately chosen. In the spring of 1971, Jim Morrison moved into that apartment with one suitcase and a notebook. He was 27 years old. He told the people who loved him that he was going to Paris to write. What he did not tell them, what he perhaps could not yet tell himself, was that he was going to Paris to find out what remained of him when everything else was stripped away. That question had been building for years, and the answer, when it finally came, would arrive in a way nobody expected, not through the music, not through the performances that had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American rock, but through the pages of a journal that almost no one was ever meant to read. But to understand what Jim Morrison was looking for in Paris, you have to understand what he had spent the previous 5 years trying to outrun. The Doors released their debut album in January 1967. Jim Morrison was 23 years old. Within 12 months, his face was on the covers of magazines he had never read, his voice was coming out of radios in cities he had never visited, and strangers were screaming his name in ways that had very little to do with who he actually was. This is the standard story of sudden fame, the gap that opens between the person and the persona, the private self and the public image, and it is true as far as it goes. But in Jim's case, the gap was wider than most because what he had put into the music was genuinely private. The poems that became the songs were not crafted for an audience. They were excavated from a place most people never visit willingly, written in hotel rooms and on scraps of paper and in notebooks that he carried everywhere, the accumulated evidence of a mind that had been working at the same dark questions since childhood. When those words became anthems, when Break On Through and Light My Fire and People Are Strange stopped being poems and became the soundtrack to a generation's self-image, Jim Morrison received something he had always wanted and found it was not what he had needed. He had wanted to be understood. What he got instead was to be reflected. Audiences gave him their own meanings, their own interpretations, their own needs. The songs became mirrors, and standing in front of a mirror, no matter how enormous it grows, is not the same as being seen. The performances that followed were extraordinary by any external measure. The Doors sold out venues across the country. Jim Morrison on a stage was an event unlike anything else happening in American music at the time, raw, unpredictable, dangerously alive in ways that made audiences feel they were witnessing something that could not be repeated. Ray Manzarek, watching from behind his organ every night, would later describe it as the most electric thing he had ever been part of. And he was right, but electricity is not the same as peace, and the man generating that electricity was carrying something beneath it that the stage lights did not reach. Because the thing about Jim Morrison that the mythology consistently simplifies is this: he was not, at his core, a performer, he was a writer who had found himself inside a performance. The two things coexisted, sometimes productively and sometimes at terrible cost, but they were never fully reconciled. The poet and the rock star inhabited the same body and spoke in the same voice, but they wanted different things. And as the years passed and the fame intensified, and the image of the Lizard King accumulated weight and expectation and a life entirely its own, the distance between those two things grew into something that Jim Morrison could feel every day and could not close. He wrote through all of it. That was the constant, not the performances, not the recordings, not the interviews or the photographs or the carefully managed mythology. The notebooks. He had been keeping them since adolescence, since the years of reading Rimbaud and Nietzsche and Blake in Naval officers' quarters across the American South. The notebooks went with him everywhere, on tour buses, into recording studios, to the parties he attended and the parties he left early. They were not journals in the conventional sense. They were not records of events or catalogs of feelings. They were something harder to name, a man thinking on paper, pressing language against questions that would not resolve, reaching toward the thing underneath the thing he had already said. By 1970, Jim Morrison had begun to speak openly about wanting to leave, not the band exactly, though that too, but the whole apparatus that had grown up around him. The image, the expectations, the version of himself that the public had decided was real, and that bore enough resemblance to the actual person to be constantly, exhaustingly confusing. He wanted to go somewhere. Nobody was looking for the Lizard King. He wanted to find out if the poet was still there when the performer stepped off the stage for long enough. Paris was the answer. It was not a random choice. Paris had been, for more than a century, the city that American artists went to when they needed to disappear into something larger than themselves, to write without the pressure of an audience, to live without the weight of reputation, to find out if the work could survive the removal of everything that had grown up around it. Jim Morrison knew this history. He had read his way through it years ago, in the same intensive, consuming way he read everything. And in the early months of 1971, he made his decision. He arrived in Paris in March. The apartment on Rue Beautreillis was small and quiet and entirely without the trappings of fame, no tour schedule. No label obligations pressing in from every direction, no photographers waiting outside the door. Pamela Corson, the woman he loved with a complicated and enduring constancy, was with him. And there was the notebook, a new one, purchased in a small shop near the Seine, the pages blank and waiting. What Jim Morrison wrote in Paris during those final months was different from anything he had written before. The shift was not immediately visible in the style. The language was still dense, still reaching, still lit from within by the same dark electricity that had always characterized his work. But the angle had changed. Where the earlier poems had pressed outward, toward the audience, toward the world, toward the confrontation of self and reality, the Paris writing pressed inward. It was a man in conversation with himself, working through questions that had no performance in them, questions about what poetry was for when there was no one listening, about what it meant to want things and receive them and find they were not the right things, about silence and whether silence was something you could learn to live in or something that slowly filled with the sounds of everything you had not yet said. He walked the city constantly. This was something people who knew him in Paris remembered consistently, the walking. Jim Morrison walked for hours through the arrondissements, alone or with Pamela Corson, stopping in bookshops and sitting in cafes and standing in front of paintings in museums with the same focused attention he had once given to the process of writing a song. He was, by all accounts, calmer in Paris than he had been in years. Not happy exactly. Happiness was not a category that Jim Morrison inhabited easily, but quieter, as if the removal of the machinery of fame had allowed something in him to settle that had been vibrating at an unsustainable frequency for a very long time. Elaine Ronne, one of the few friends he made in Paris during those months, later described conversations with Jim that were unlike anything he had expected from a rock star of that magnitude. Jim was not interested in talking about the music or the fame or the public events of his life. He was interested in talking about poetry, specifically about the question of whether poetry could do something that other forms of language could not, whether it could create a space between two people where genuine contact happened, where the distance that separates one consciousness from another actually, briefly, closed. This had always been the question underneath all the other questions for Jim Morrison, not fame, not legacy, not the Lizard King, the distance and what could be done about it. The notebook accumulated pages through April and into the early summer of 1971. Jim Morrison worked in the apartment in the mornings, walked in the afternoons, and returned to the pages in the evenings. He did not, during this period, speak much about going back. He spoke instead about what he was writing, about the shape the work was taking, about the feeling, rare enough to be remarkable, of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. He was 27 years old and he was, by his own account, beginning. Jim Morrison died on July 3, 1971. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was found in the bathtub of the Rue Beautreillis apartment in the early hours of the morning. Pamela Corson was the only other person present. He was buried 4 days later in Père Lachaise cemetery, in the section that held Oscar Wilde and Frédéric Chopin and a long history of artists who had come to Paris looking for something and found, at varying costs, what they were searching for. The notebook was found in the apartment after his death. It passed through several hands before portions of it were eventually published, years later, as part of the collection of his writings. But what strikes those who have read the Paris Journal closely is not its darkness, though there is darkness in it, but its quality of attention. These are the pages of a person who is paying very close attention to what is in front of him, to the texture of ordinary moments, to the way light falls in a Paris courtyard in the early morning, to the feeling of a pen moving across paper when there is no one waiting for the result. Ray Manzarek, who had known Jim Morrison longer and more deeply than almost anyone, received the news of his death while in Los Angeles. He would later say that what he felt was not entirely surprise, not because he had expected it, but because there was something in Jim's departure for Paris that had always felt like a kind of reckoning, a deliberate turning towards something that could not be indefinitely postponed. What surprised him was the timing. Jim had seemed, in the months before his death, more at peace than Ray Manzarek had seen him in years. The Paris experiment, incomplete as it turned out to be, had been working. The poet had been finding his way back to the page. In the decades since, the mythology surrounding Jim Morrison has continued to grow: the leather, the lizard king, the 27 Club, the Père Lachaise grave that became a pilgrimage site, the image frozen at its most iconic and circulated endlessly through a culture hungry for symbols of beautiful self-destruction. All of that is real in its way, but it is not the whole story. It is not even, perhaps, the most important part of the story. The most important part might be the Paris notebook. The pages written in a small apartment on Rue Beautreillis by a young man who had walked away from everything the world valued about him in order to find out if the thing he valued about himself was still there. Who had traded the Lizard King for a quiet courtyard and a blank page? Who had been in those final months something he rarely got to be in public, simply a writer working? Jim Morrison wanted to be understood more than he wanted to be famous. He had said as much. Various forms throughout his life, in interviews, in poems, in the long conversations he had with the few people he trusted enough to speak honestly. The fame had arrived first, enormous and disorienting, and had spent years obscuring the thing it was supposedly celebrating. Paris was the attempt to reverse that, to strip the image back down to the person, to find out if the person could still breathe without the apparatus of legends surrounding him. He was 27 years old. He was beginning. Some things end before they are finished. That is not the same as failing. The Paris notebook is not a document of defeat. It is a document of someone moving deliberately and with clear eyes toward the thing that mattered most to him. The poems in those pages are quieter than the songs that made him famous. They do not press outward with the same electric urgency. They listen instead. They attend. They do what all the best writing does, which is to make the reader feel that someone somewhere was paying the kind of attention that most of us manage only rarely, the attention that says, "This moment is real, and it matters, and I am here inside it, and that is enough." The window on Rue Beautreillis still faces the same courtyard. The light still falls the same way in the early morning. And somewhere in the long history of that city that has sheltered so many artists who came looking for something, there is a trace of a 27-year-old poet who found, briefly and imperfectly and at great cost, exactly what he was looking for. And then the world lost him before he could tell us what it was. What is less remembered about Jim Morrison's Paris months is the quality of his daily life there. Not the events, of which there were few, but the texture. He rose early, which surprised people who knew him primarily through the mythology of late nights and chaos. He made coffee in the small kitchen of the Rue Beautreillis apartment and carried it to the desk near the window before the courtyard below had fully woken up. He wrote for 2 or 3 hours in that morning stillness. Then he stopped, closed the notebook, and went out. The Paris he walked through was not the Paris of tourists or of the literary mythology he had grown up reading. It was the Paris of a person who has decided to actually live somewhere rather than visit the specific neighborhoods, the particular cafes where the light was right, the bookshops where he could spend an hour without anyone recognizing him or wanting anything from him. Anonymity, which had been stolen from him so completely in America, had been quietly returned to him here. He could walk into a cafe on the left bank and order coffee and sit and read and leave without a single person treating him as anything other than another American in Paris. The relief of that was something he mentioned repeatedly in those final months, not in interviews, because he was giving no interviews, but in the conversations with Elaine Ronne and the letters he occasionally wrote back to people in Los Angeles. One of those letters, written in May 1971 to a friend in California, described a morning on the banks of the Seine that had lasted most of a day. Jim had taken the notebook and walked to the river and sat on the stone embankment and written for 6 hours. He did not say what he had written. He said only that by the time he finally stood up and walked back toward the apartment, something in him that had been tightly wounded for years had begun, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. That letter, like most of what Jim Morrison wrote in Paris, was not intended for public consumption. It was a private communication from a private person, and the distinction matters because the vast majority of what we think we know about Jim Morrison comes from the public record, from the performances and the interviews and the photographs and the journalism. The private record is much smaller and much quieter and tells a different story than the legend. The private record says, "This was a man who loved poetry in the most literal sense, who found in language a companionship that he could not always find in people, who read constantly and widely, not to accumulate knowledge, but because books were, for him, the most reliable form of contact with other minds, who believed with a seriousness that the rock star image tended to obscure, that writing was the most important thing a human being could do with the fact of consciousness, who went to Paris not to escape but to return to the desk, to the notebook, to the work that had been there before the fame arrived, and that he trusted, with a quiet and unshakable conviction, would still be there if he could find his way back to it."